Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to our channel, True Courtroom Stories.
It's great to be back.
We always appreciate you being here, and we'd love it if you, our listeners, would take a moment to subscribe to the channel and maybe like and share this with your friends.
It really does help us continue to bring you these stories.
Absolutely. This is episode 1114 of True Courtroom Stories, researched by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir.
A really fascinating set of materials for us to work with today.
It really is. Today we're doing a deep dive into a topic that is just constantly in the headlines, constantly relevant. We're talking about the intersection of media freedom and the necessary boundaries of speech.
And we're drawing from a really interesting stack of sources here. It's titled Excerpts from the Jurisprudence of Free Speech and Media Accountability. And it gives us a very focused, comparative look at how different legal philosophies define the absolute edge of free speech.
Right, and that's our mission for you today. We want to move past the sort of bumper sticker idea of free speech and really understand the boundary conditions.
Exactly. The goal here is to distill what the sources tell us about that precise moment, that tipping point, where freedom stops being this absolute, untouchable right.
And accountability begins.
And accountability begins, regardless of whether you're in one legal system or a completely different one across the globe.
Okay, so let's unpack this. I think the core question that's going to guide our whole discussion today is simple to ask, but, well, profoundly difficult to apply.
Always is.
When does that right to speak or publish actually stop, and when does accountability kick in?
That's the billion-dollar question.
So let's get into it. The sources start with this foundational idea, this constraint. They call it the ratio.
The ratio, yeah.
And it states very plainly, speech is free until it harms justice or peace. It's, a two-part test.
A litmus test, really.
Yeah, a litmus test. So how does a principle that sounds that simple, how does it manage to be the philosophical hinge for systems that seem so different? I mean, you're talking about Islamic jurisprudence on one hand and the global free press doctrine on the other.
Well, it works because it establishes a really fundamental truth about society. It says that freedom isn't just this inherent state of nature. It's a conditional right.
Conditional.
It's a right that's granted within an ordered structure. And that structure, to survive, relies on two things you absolutely cannot negotiate on.
Justice and peace.
Justice and peace. The rule of law, which delivers justice, and public security, which delivers peace. Any system, democratic, theocratic, you name it, will ultimately restrict speech the moment it threatens the very foundations of its own existence.
So the ratio is just defining those foundations.
It's the bedrock. Everything else is built on top of it.
Okay, let's break that down then. Let's take the first pillar, harms justice.
This feels like the most direct conflict for the media, right? Their duty to inform the public crashes right into the state's duty to run a fair trial.
It's the classic collision.
So what are the specific, legal mechanisms where a news report can actually be seen as harming justice? The main one, the one that comes up again and again, is interference with the judicial process. And this all falls under the big legal umbrella of contempt of court.
Right, contempt of court.
But it's so much more nuanced than, just saying something mean about a judge. It involves publishing material that could significantly prejudice a trial.
Prejudice a trial? You mean like sway a jury before they've heard the evidence?
Precisely. Many legal systems have a rule for this, often called the rule of sub judice.
Sub judice.
Which literally means under judgment. So if a case is pending or it's actively in trial, the media's hands are, in many ways, tied when it comes to specific kinds of commentary.
So what can't they do? What kind of reporting crosses that line?
Well, think about it. If the media starts publishing alleged evidence that hasn't been presented in court, or witness testimonies, or just running these really sensationalized opinion pieces about the guilt or innocence of the accused.
Or digging up their past, their prior convictions.
Exactly. Or inflammatory background info. What you're doing is corrupting the pool of potential jurors. You're creating a situation where the accused person might not be able to get a fair trial because a narrative has already been set in stone outside the courtroom.
A narrative that wasn't built on evidence that's been cross-examined or reviewed by a judge?
Yes. You've hit on the core difference. It's the difference between establishing truth through a controlled, evidence-based process versus establishing a truth through public opinion and, frankly, sensationalism.
It's trial by media.
It is the definition of trial by media. And in many common law systems, you'll see contempt broken down even further. You might have what's called passive contempt.
Passive.
Which is publishing that sensationalized, prejudicial material we just talked about. And then you have active contempt, which is more direct. It could be something like trying to intimidate a witness or aggressively attacking a judge's personal integrity or their impartiality while a case is still live.
So once the verdict is in and the sentence is delivered, can the media then go all out?
For the most part, yes. Criticizing a finalized verdict or a sentence usually falls under the umbrella of political commentary or analysis that's generally seen as fair game. But attacking the integrity of the process while it's happening or actively trying to bias the outcome, that's a direct harm to justice.
What's really standing out to me here is that this restriction on speech, it isn't really there to protect the government or the state, per se.
No, not at its core.
It's there to protect the individual's right to due process. It's protecting the very heart of justice itself.
You're protecting the mechanism. That's the perfect way to put it. A judicial system is this carefully designed structure. Evidence comes in, it's tested, it's weighed, all under very specific rules. When media reports just bypass that entire structure,
You're blowing it up.
they're destroying the conditions you need to have a legitimate verdict in the first place. And that's why judges have tools like publication bans or gag orders, or sometimes even sequestering a jury.
They're building a firewall.
They're building a firewall to protect that first half of the ratio. They are ensuring justice remains as uncompromised as humanly possible by any outside influence.
Okay, that makes a huge amount of legal sense. It's a very clear, very defined space. But now, let's turn to that second pillar, the one that feels a lot less clear.
Yes, harm's peace.
It feels broader, more volatile. If due process and contempt rules are the guardrails for justice, how on earth do legal systems put guardrails around a concept as massive as peace?
This is where things get really complex. This is where the legal system has to confront threats to public order, to national security, to the very stability of a community or the state itself.
The boundaries must be incredibly sensitive.
They are, and they're often very culturally specific. But the fundamental idea, the constraint, is universal. It covers a huge territory, from something as direct as incitement to violence, all the way to really complex questions of national security secrets.
All right, let's start with the most immediate threat then. Incitement. How do you draw the line between someone expressing a deeply controversial or even offensive political view, which should be protected, and speech that is actively trying to push society into chaos?
Well, jurisprudence has wrestled with this for centuries. In systems that are influenced by, say, the American model, they often fall back on some version of the clear and present danger test.
I've heard that phrase. What does it actually mean in practice?
It means you're looking for speech that is specifically directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. The two key words there are intent and imminence.
So it's not enough for the words to just be inflammatory?
No,
They have to be calculated to produce a specific, immediate, illegal result.
precisely. Let's take the example of promoting sectarian conflict. A legal system would step in when a media outlet publishes something that isn't just critical of a group, but is specifically designed or calculated to promote hatred, violence, or real animosity between groups.
Based on religion or ethnicity.
Right. Anything that tears at the social fabric and directly jeopardizes public order. So if your communication moves from, I disagree with this group's policy, to go attack this group's members, you've crossed the line.
The media's freedom to criticize the government is and should be very robust.
Extremely. But their freedom to use their massive platform to tear society apart through hate-driven incitement is and has to be universally conditional.
And what about the other end of that scale? You mentioned national security. This is the classic movie scenario, right? The journalist uncovers a huge secret that's true, but publishing it could be catastrophic.
It's a massive ethical and legal dilemma. This is where you have to balance the media's vital watchdog role against the state's absolute #1 duty, which is to protect its citizens and its existence.
So things like revealing military troop movements in a war.
Or the identities of intelligence operatives in hostile territory, or, classified blueprints for a new defense system. These are things that directly jeopardize peace and national security.
And in those cases, the state can step in.
In those scenarios, even in systems that absolutely hate the idea of prior restraint, you'll see significant post-publication accountability criminal charges, for instance. And in the most extreme cases, courts might even consider an injunction or a suppression order to stop the publication.
Though I imagine those are fought tooth and nail.
Oh, absolutely. They are, and should be, incredibly rare and highly contested. But they exist as a last resort to protect peace.
So this ratio, speech is free until it harms justice or peace, it really is the philosophical anchor for all of this.
It's the unifying theory. It's the starting point.
Okay, so now we can take that anchor and test it. We can see how it holds up against the three specific legal philosophies that our source material provides.
Exactly. And what you'll see is that these systems we're about to discuss, they don't really invent new limits out of thin air. They just formalize the mechanisms for enforcing this one universal foundational constraint.
All right, so our first specific perspective from the sources is Islamic jurisprudence. And it's summarized with this really potent phrase, accountability without slander.
Yes. And that phrase immediately tells you something. It sets media freedom within a moral and ethical context right from the start.
Which is a pretty sharp difference from a purely secular legal philosophy.
It's a very different starting point. What's unique here is that this system often sees media freedom not just as a right you possess, but as a moral and civic duty you must perform.
A duty.
A duty.
Yeah.
The idea of accountability here is partly derived from a core principle, Amrul bil Maruf wa Nahi anil Munkar.
Which means?
Broadly, enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong. It's seen as a communal and also an individual obligation to monitor and, if necessary, correct the actions of people in power. The goal is to ensure transparency, truth-telling, and justice.
Wow. That's just a profoundly active role for the press and for the public. The media isn't just a passive watchdog in this model.
Not at all.
It's an active agent of moral and governmental reform. It's almost mandated to investigate and expose corruption or misconduct. That is an incredibly powerful platform.
It is an incredibly powerful platform, but that power is absolutely conditional. It's conditional on total adherence to truth and a deep respect for human dignity.
And that's where the second half of the phrase comes in.
That's where without slander becomes the critical check and balance, both legally and ethically. The permission slip to pursue accountability is ripped up the second a publisher crosses the very strict lines against defamation.
Okay, let's get into the technicals of that. The sources mention specific prohibitions against slander. They use terms like qadhf, ghiba, and namima. How do these function as actual legal breaks on what a journalist can do?
They're all mechanisms that detail the different ways you could destroy a person's reputation. Qadhf is probably the most serious.
Why that one in particular?
Because qadhf refers to the false accusation of a very grave moral or criminal sin, like adultery or theft. These are accusations that, if they were proven true in an Islamic legal system, could carry severe state-administered penalties for the accused.
So the stakes are incredibly high for the person being accused.
Immensely high. And because of that, the system places an extraordinarily high burden of proof on the accuser. In our context, that means the journalist or the publisher.
That high burden of proof feels like the key difference here. In a lot of Western legal systems, the burden is often on the person who's defamed to prove the statement was false and that it was damaging.
Exactly, you've nailed it. Here, the model is flipped. The journalist has to be able to demonstrate the absolute truth of their claim before they publish, or they face serious liability themselves.
How high is that burden? What does it take to prove a claim of qadhf?
For the most serious offenses, the traditional standard often requires 4 credible, morally upright witnesses to the act itself. It's an almost impossible standard to meet for many situations.
So if a journalist can't meet that burden and publishes anyway,
then they themselves are subject to punishment for false accusation, for qadhf. This extreme risk forces a level of pre-publication rigor and verification that goes far, far beyond what a typical civil libel standard might demand.
the penalty isn't just a fine then.
It's not just a civil penalty. It could be a specified criminal punishment, and that acts as a very powerful deterrent against any kind of reckless reporting, especially when it comes to someone's personal moral character.
Okay, that covers qadhf. What about the other two terms, ghiba and namima? How do they limit the media, especially if the media is reporting on something that's actually true?
This is a fascinating distinction. Ghiba is often translated as backbiting. It means revealing a person's private faults or their personal defects, even if the information is true, if that revelation serves no legitimate public good or legal necessity.
So truth is not an absolute defense.
Not always. The context matters. And namima is a bit different. It's malicious gossip that's specifically intended to sow discord and create conflict between people or groups.
So together, these concepts stop the media from just engaging in, sensationalized intrusions into private life for the sake of clicks or ratings.
Exactly. It forces a test of relevance and public necessity. So let's say a powerful public official has some private, embarrassing truth about their personal life. If that truth has zero bearing on their ability to govern or on their public policy,
Then publishing it could be a violation.
it could be considered ghiba.
Yeah.
The system forces the media to constantly ask, why are we publishing this? Is it to serve the public's need for accountability, like exposing corruption? If yes, it's permitted. Or is it just to destroy a private reputation for sport or to cause malicious embarrassment? If that's the reason, it's forbidden.
The core principle behind all of this seems to be the protection of personal honor.
The stringent protection of personal honor and reputation, which are seen as absolutely fundamental to social stability.
Okay, let's tie this back to our main theory, the ratio. The ratio is about protecting justice and peace. How does this rule, accountability without slander, do that?
It serves both pillars directly. Slander harms justice, because when you publicize these unfounded, serious accusations, you're basically conducting a trial outside the court. You're usurping the judicial process and denying the accused due process.
Trial by media again.
Right. And it harms peace, because it recklessly destroys individual reputations, which are seen as a cornerstone of society. It fuels distrust, animosity, and conflict. That's the definition of nomima.
So the jurisprudence recognizes that if you destroy reputation, you destroy social harmony.
You do. So the freedom of the press in this model is explicitly conditional.
Yeah.
It's dependent on maintaining that social harmony through reporting that is truthful, non-malicious, and, crucially, necessary.
What's really fascinating here is that even though the method of constraint is rooted in moral and religious principles, the outcome it's trying to achieve is identical to the secular goal, maintaining an ordered, functional, and just society.
It's a different path to the same destination. It makes accountability, the political function, inseparable from truthfulness, the moral function. And the threat of severe penalties ensures that the line is drawn very, very conservatively, prioritizing individual dignity and the rigor of truth above almost everything else.
Okay, so now let's shift gears completely. Let's move to what might seem like the opposite end of the spectrum, starting with very different assumptions. The global free press doctrine.
Right.
This is the model that I think most people in Western democracies are most familiar with. It champions the media as the fourth estate. It starts with an assumption of maximum freedom, and it generally only wants to restrict speech as an absolute last resort.
This perspective is really deeply rooted in Enlightenment principles,
Yeah.
in the idea of democratic self-governance.
How so?
Well, the core idea is that for a population to make informed choices about its leaders and its future, there has to be a free and open exchange of information. So freedom of expression isn't just a nice-to-have. It's foundational to individual autonomy and to democracy itself.
So the default setting is freedom.
The default is freedom.
Mm.
Any restrictions have to be seen as exceptions to the rule, and they have to be very narrowly defined and completely justified.
So can you describe the core tenets that really define this doctrine? What makes this philosophy the bedrock of media law in so many countries?
I'd say the first, and maybe the most important, is a deep rejection of minimal prior restraint.
Prior restraint, that's the government stepping in before something is published.
Exactly. It's the idea of censorship. This doctrine holds as a non-negotiable principle that government should not have the power to suppress content before it sees the light of day. This is seen as absolutely critical if the media is going to be able to fulfill its watchdog role without the executive branch constantly looking over its shoulder.
But why is prior restraint such a hard red line? I mean, why not let the state review something that might genuinely harm national security before it gets out?
Because the power of pre-publication censorship is seen as the single greatest tool a repressive government has in its arsenal. History shows that once you grant that power, it is almost impossible to limit. It always expands.
So the doctrine prefers to deal with the consequences later.
It strongly prefers post-publication accountability. Let the speech happen. If it causes a clearly defined legal harm like defamation or a genuine security breach, then the publisher is held responsible for it after the fact. This is seen as far less chilling to public discourse than having a government official with a red pen deciding what you're allowed to say.
Okay, that makes sense. The second key tenet, then, the one that sort of justifies the high tolerance for even controversial speech, must be the marketplace of ideas theory.
Absolutely. This is the philosophical engine of the whole doctrine. It's the theory that truth isn't some fixed thing handed down from on high. It's something that emerges from robust, vigorous, sometimes messy debate.
So even bad ideas should be allowed.
The theory says yes. Even seemingly false or offensive ideas should be allowed to compete in the public square because suppressing bad ideas doesn't make them go away. It often just makes them more attractive by driving them underground.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
That's the idea. Open engagement is seen as the best mechanism for the better argument to ultimately prevail. And this philosophy provides the justification for the media's relentless, and often very necessary, watchdog role. The ability to challenge government authority without fear of being silenced before you even speak.
Okay, so we have this philosophical model that tries to maximize speed as much as possible. But we know from our foundational ratio that no freedom is absolute. There are always inherited limits. So where do those limits show up in the global free press model?
They absolutely exist. They just manifest in different ways, primarily through civil law and some very carefully constructed criminal exceptions. You see the constraints in laws about defamation, like libel and slander.
Which protects private reputation.
Exactly. It serves the harms justice pillar by preventing the reckless destruction of character. And then you also have laws about national security, incitement, and obscenity, which all serve the harms peace pillar.
Now, what's interesting is how differently these limits are applied, even within countries that subscribe to this general doctrine. The source material hints at this. How do, say, European and North American approaches differ when they're drawing that line?
Oh, they draw the line in very different places, and that reflects different societal priorities. In the United States, for example, the line is drawn exceptionally far in favor of the speaker, especially when the speech is about public figures.
Right. It's famously hard for a politician to win a libel case in the U.S.
It's incredibly difficult. To win, a public figure usually has to prove not just that the published statement was false and damaging, but that it was published with actual malice.
And actual malice means?
It means the publisher either knew it was false when they printed it, or they acted with a reckless disregard for whether it was true or not. That is a very, very high bar to clear, and it's designed that way on purpose to protect even fierce and sometimes mistaken political debate.
So the U.S. system is prioritizing that watchdog function and the marketplace of ideas above almost everything else.
Correct, even if it means some individual public reputations might take a hit along the way. Now, you can contrast that with many European jurisdictions. Think of France or Germany. While they absolutely have a free press, they often have much stronger legal protections for privacy and personal dignity.
So you couldn't just publish anything, even if it's true.
Not necessarily. Publishing highly intrusive, even if true, details about a private person's life might lead to a successful lawsuit much more easily than it would in the U.S. And to take it a step further, a country like Germany specifically restricts certain types of speech.
Like Holocaust denial.
Like Holocaust denial. Because that specific speech, given their history, is seen as actively harming peace and undermining the entire constitutional order.
So the global doctrine isn't this one single monolithic thing. It's more of a philosophy that lets countries customize their own constraints.
That's a great way to put it. But those customized constraints always ultimately serve the underlying ratio of preventing harm to justice or peace.
So whether it's strict libel laws protecting reputation and justice, or a ban on certain kinds of hate speech to protect public order and peace, the boundary exists everywhere.
The existence of the boundary is universal. The global free press doctrine just argues that the starting position, the default, is liberty. And any encroachment on that liberty has to be as small as possible and subject to judicial review. It shifts the burden of proof.
How so?
It puts the burden of proof on the party trying to restrict the speech, so the state or the person who was offended, rather than placing that high preemptive burden on the journalist, which is what we saw in the Islamic model.
It's this perpetual tension, isn't it? You need freedom for a society to be stable, but you also need stability for freedom to even exist.
And this doctrine tries to manage that tension by betting on public debate and transparency as the best long-term solution.
Which brings us to our third and final perspective. Here we get to anchor this whole comparative analysis in a specific legal text, which the sources highlight for us. Article 19 of the Constitution of Pakistan.
Right. This is great because it lets us see how a modern constitutional state takes all this theory we've been discussing and tries to formalize it into law.
So what does Article 19 say at the outset?
Well, it starts by explicitly guaranteeing the freedom of speech and expression and the freedom of the press. So right off the bat, its commitment aligns with the general aspirations of the global free press doctrine. It sets the baseline expectation that media operation is a fundamental right.
But as we've established over and over, these constitutional guarantees are never a blank check.
Never absolute.
They almost always come with riders or, what's the legal term you used?
Reasonable restrictions.
Reasonable restrictions.
And what's crucial about Article 19 is that it formalizes this balance. It doesn't just say there can be restrictions. It explicitly lists. It enumerates the precise areas where the state is allowed to impose them.
And that list is significant.
It's extremely significant. It's basically the legal roadmap for how the state of Pakistan enforces that universal ratio within its own specific context.
Okay, so let's walk through that list. What are the specific categories of restriction? Let's start with the ones that are about protecting the state itself.
The first set of restrictions is really focused on national existence and identity. Freedom of speech can be restricted in the interest of the glory of Islam, the integrity, security, or defense of Pakistan, and maintaining friendly relations with foreign states.
Those seem like very clear mechanisms for preventing large-scale harm to peace.
They are. And the inclusion of the glory of Islam is fascinating because it links this very modern constitutional framework directly back to the ethical concerns we saw in the Islamic jurisprudence section.
It's merging religious reverence right into the state's legal definition of what constitutes peace and order.
It acts as a constitutional safeguard. It prohibits media content that would be deemed blasphemous or deeply offensive to the nation's core religious identity. While it's formalized in the Constitution, the goal is the same as the harms peace principle, preventing widespread social discord that could be catastrophically disruptive.
And the others, integrity, security, defense. That's the national security argument we discussed earlier, just written right into the Constitution.
It's a direct application of the harms peace pillar in the most critical sense.
Okay, so that's the state's security. What about domestic order? How does Article 19 handle things like public disruption or morality?
That's the second set of restrictions. It handles internal stability. It allows the law to restrict speech in the interest of public order, decency, or morality.
And this would be the constitutional tool for what exactly?
For prohibiting media from doing things like inciting riots or publishing material that's deemed obscene or promoting something that fundamentally violates the country's widely held cultural norms. It's about ensuring social equilibrium, what you might call internal peace.
This really highlights the ongoing challenge, though, defining terms like decency or morality. These aren't fixed legal terms, they're fluid.
They absolutely are. And that's where judicial interpretation comes in. It inevitably introduces cultural context into what is, on the surface, a purely legal question.
The courts have to constantly wrestle with where society is drawing that line at any given moment.
That is the reality of constitutional law. But the overarching intent of the Constitution remains consistent. The goal is to prevent speech that is actively pushing society toward lawlessness or a breakdown of social cohesion.
And then finally, we have the restrictions that map directly onto the other half of our ratio, the harms justice part.
Yes, and these are found in the provisions related to the legal system itself, specifically contempt of court and incitement to an offense.
Contempt of court. There it is again, explicit.
It's the clear constitutional command to protect the integrity of the judicial process. It gives the legal backing to ensure that the media cannot prejudice judges or juries or aggressively undermine the authority of the courts. It's the safeguard for due process.
And the incitement to an offense clause that links back to the idea of imminence we talked about. It's about preventing the media from being used as a tool to provoke immediate illegal acts.
Precisely. And what's so significant about the way Article 19 is structured is that the state doesn't have to make a broad philosophical argument that some speech caused evade harm. The Constitution gives them a defined, pre-approved list of harms that can justify a restriction.
It's a checklist.
It's a constitutional checklist.
Right.
The legal system uses these enumerated restrictions as the formal way it disciplines media freedom to make sure it stays within the lines of our core ratio, protecting justice and peace.
The comparison is really striking when you lay it all out like that. Whether you start with the high ethical burden of Islamic law, or the democratic presumption of freedom in the global doctrine, or the enumerated written down restrictions in Article 19.
The destination is the same.
The functional limits they all place on media freedom are all directed toward the exact same dual goals: fairness in the courts and stability in society.
It shows a remarkable consensus in legal philosophy across incredibly diverse systems. The right to speak is essential, yes, but it's ultimately subordinate to the necessity of maintaining an ordered society that is capable of guaranteeing that right in the first place.
So accountability isn't the enemy of freedom.
In this view, accountability is the means of self-preservation for the legal structure that makes freedom possible.
So we've dissected these three really different starting points. We had ethical duty, we had democratic necessity, and we had constitutional formalization. And yet, as you said, the limitations all seem to converge.
They do. And that pattern of convergence is really the central insight of this whole deep dive.
It seems like the global debate about media freedom, then, isn't really about whether limits should exist.
No, that's a settled question. The real debate is about where you draw those universal lines of justice and peace, and how heavily you decide to enforce them.
Let's just break down that common thread one last time, focusing on how each perspective distinctly approaches protecting that ratio.
Okay, so the Islamic concept, it protects honor and truth above all else. It uses that strict prohibition on slander, on kaf, to enforce both justice by demanding that insane burden of proof for accusations, and peace by preserving the dignity that holds society together.
And the accountability mechanism is all about the ethical conduct of the journalists before they get published.
It's preemptive. Then you have the global free press doctrine, which protects the debate and the public interest. Its boundaries are drawn much further out. It prefers to hold people accountable after publication for things like defamation or clear and imminent threats.
It prioritizes the flow of ideas, basically accepting that a little bit of disruption or messiness is just the price you pay for a healthy democracy.
Exactly. And finally, the Pakistani Constitutional Model Article 19, it provides the formal legal scaffolding for all these restrictions. It explicitly writes down the protections for national security, for public order, and for the integrity of the courts in its list of reasonable restrictions.
It feels like the most pragmatic approach, in a way. It's blending that religious and cultural sensitivity with modern constitutional due process.
It's an attempt to create a hybrid that fits its specific context.
So the big conclusion here, the main takeaway for you, is that media freedom is this incredibly robust and essential right. It's the engine of democracy and accountability, but it is intrinsically conditional.
Absolutely. The moment the media's exercise of its freedom threatens the rule of law or the stability of the very society it's supposed to be serving, accountability has to kick in.
Whether that's a severe ethical penalty, a civil lawsuit for defamation, or a constitutional restriction.
The restriction is the necessary price that's paid to maintain the framework that guarantees the freedom in the first place. It's a paradox, but it's a necessary one.
It's a really elegant way to summarize it. It recognizes the immense power of the press, while also acknowledging that it has to be subservient to the foundational principles of a stable civilization.
It forces all of us, really, to view accountability not as an attack on freedom, but as a mechanism of social self-defense. It's what ensures that freedom doesn't just collapse into chaos on one side or injustice on the other.
So throughout this discussion, we've analyzed this core ratio. Speech is free until it harms justice or peace. But given the world we live in now, with the unprecedented speed of digital media,
It changes everything.
it does. Publications are instantaneous. They cross borders in a fraction of a second. Algorithmic amplification can make a single piece of viral misinformation spread faster and wider than any newspaper in history ever could.
The scale is completely different.
So that leaves us with this final, and I think really provocative question for you to think about. Does the sheer velocity of our digital world mean that the traditional legal definition of what constitutes harm to peace, which, as you said, often relied on finding intent and imminence?
A direct, immediate link.
Right. Does that old definition need to be redrawn? Do we need a new one to address the almost instantaneous global threat that can be posed by digital incitement? And if we do need a new definition, considering the global nature of all these platforms, which jurisdiction, or who, should be the ultimate judge of where that new boundary lies?
And that is the central dilemma of jurisprudence in the 21st century. How do you define a timeless boundary in a world of instantaneous, borderless communication?
A question with no easy answers. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the jurisprudence of free speech and media accountability. We hope this analysis has given you a clearer framework for understanding the universal conditions that govern the immense power of the Fourth Estate.